Hi and welcome to Module 2. We're going to be looking at how to make visual decisions. You'll have learned from Module 1 how to set the aperture and shutter speed. Now we're going to look at how those control the visual effects that you can create. It's important that we understand how to manipulate either the shutter speed or the aperture in order to achieve the desired visual effect, either blurring or freezing motion, or creating focus or very shallow focus, either through the shutter speed or the aperture, and which one of those effects is most important. We then combine the camera settings appropriately for the effect we want to create. We're now going to discuss the aperture in a bit more detail. Depth of field is defined as how much of the subject from the nearest point of the foreground to the furthest point in the background is sharply focused. The following three factors influence depth of field. Firstly, the lens's focal length, whether you've zoomed out to 18 or zoomed in to 55mm on your kit lens. The second one is your camera to subject distance. The third one being your aperture setting. The smaller the f number, for example f4, to a larger f number of f22 will indicate whether you have a shallow or a deep depth of field. Let's have a look at shutter speed in a bit more detail. As you would have already begun to understand from Module 1, shutter speed controls the length of time the sensor is exposed to light. The visual effect can only be seen when photographing a moving subject. Depending on your shutter speed setting and the subject's speed, the camera will either blur or stop motion. Fast shutter speeds for sport freeze the movement of the subject, an example being 1/1000th of a second, and a slow shutter speed will blur a moving object at roughly 1/60th of a second and slower. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of some pictures that I've taken over the last few years. The first one is a food shot, and you'll notice there's only a small part of the dish or the food that's in focus. The rest, the foreground and background, is out of focus. We've used an aperture of f4, which creates the shallow depth of field. The second example, we're going to look at this landscape. You'll notice there's a deep or maximum depth of field. Using an aperture of f22, we've got sharp focus from the foreground through middle ground right to the background. Secondly, we're going to look at some examples where shutter speed comes into play. Here we've got a motorbike moving at high speed. I've used a slow shutter speed of a 1/60th of a second to blur the motion and create the impression of movement. The second example is a BMX rider jumping. I've managed to freeze the motion here using a fast shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. To sum up Module 2, remember we looked at aperture, which controls the depth of field or how much focus we have through the image, either using a small aperture of f22, which creates a large depth of field, or opening up to a wide aperture of f4, which creates shallow depth of field or minimum focus. The second concept we looked at was the shutter speed and how that either freezes or blurs motion using a slow shutter speed of a 1/60th of a second or slower to blur movement, or using a very fast shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second and upwards to freeze motion. Please check out your assignments on how to set the aperture and shutter speed. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing your pictures, and we'll catch up with you on the online discussion forums.